For those who weren't here yesterday, my name's Brian Murphy, and I am Dean of the College of Liberal and Applied Arts at Stephen F. Austin State University. And I'm just going to walk you through what our program is about today and provide a brief introduction. This is part of what we call our Global Citizenship series. And the reason that we have it here in Houston is that, as we all know, Houston is a vital cog in international commerce. And we have speakers and events almost daily here. But the problem is the public needs to be more than just informed. We need to understand the big picture of where the world is headed. We cannot invest, we cannot trade, and we cannot make significant financial transactions without the assurance that our economic decisions are secure. The problem is that such overall clarity does not exist today. Going back to 1991, President then George H. Bush announced that we are in a new world order with the demise of the Soviet Union. But now, almost 25 years later, we are still waiting for that global order to materialize. Since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. response to international crises has been what I call reflexive. We didn't have a stable pattern. We don't have a stable doctrine to guide us. For each crisis, we have to piece together a group of allies to go in. We no longer have, like we did during the Cold War, an us versus them. That is, the USSR versus NATO. And that's the problem that we have today. Shimon Peres, who's former Prime Minister of Israel, once said, "When you lose your enemy, you lose your foreign policy." And to a very large degree, that's what we have right now. So what this Global Citizenship series is designed to do is to try to make sense from this fluid international situation that we currently have. Look, we can't do any worse than what's being done currently. A favorite quote of mine is by W.H. Auden. He said, "One cannot review a bad book without showing off." We're not trying to show off. We just have a bad situation that we're trying to understand. We have held 3 events so far in this series. We've looked at the relationship between the United States and Europe, the United States and the Middle East, and last year, the United States and Latin America. Today, of course, is the United States and Asia. Next year will be the United States and Africa. And our goal after each one of these conferences is to come up with a set of recommendations, and that's what our last panel will be about today, where we try to define some areas of consensus from among our experts here about what direction the United States should take in its relationship with, in this case, Asia. We will then try to piece all those various conclusions together, and so that hopefully in about 2 or 3 years, we will have a global architecture that results from this series of conferences. We take our recommendations and then translate them into an edited book, and our first one on the transatlantic relationship has just been published last year, and our one on Latin America is just about done now. Now, we have a very difficult topic to talk about. Asia is not a very simple place. It is not one place, it is many places. So now, to provide answers to these very difficult questions, I'm fortunate that I don't have to answer them. I have a panel of experts who's going to put it all together for us. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Tom Segady. Dr. Segady is a professor of sociology at Stephen F. Austin State University. He is quite a renowned person in his own right. He's had two Fulbrights, one to India and the other was to Germany. So he's very well known in the international circles and obviously an excellent person to handle a panel on Asia and the social context. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Segady, and you have to excuse us while we hand this off.
That's right. We've got to transmit the stage. Can you hear me okay? Is that all right? In the back, okay, that's great. Well, I thank you all for being here. I mean, it's just really a pleasure to be here with everybody. And I want to give a special shout out to the students that are here from the high schools. I mean, It was really, I mean, the buzz last night really was about you and the quality of those comments. Those are just amazing. Those questions were fantastic. And it's so nice to have you visit us here. So what we'd like you to do now is visit us there on our campus and look at the kinds of things that we have to offer for you. We are living in such a different time, and your generation knows that more than anybody else. I mean, it's just amazing. What is your generation called, guys in high school? What is it called that we can say out loud? Well, here's one that has never been applied really to any other generation. We've been lost. We've been okay. Yours is called the global generation, and that means something very different, that you'll live in a world that no other generation has ever lived in before. How many of you will be traveling and living, maybe working overseas? All right, that's a pretty good show of hands, and that's a pretty honest answer, too. There are about 5 million people from your generation who will live and work overseas. You still may be an American, but you'll be living overseas and working. That means that you will really want to provide a good environment for yourselves and your families, because you'll be there for quite a long time with your families, some of you. And in fact, do you plan on having kids? Do you plan on having a daughter? I'm going somewhere with this demographic fact. If you do, the chances are 50-50 right now that that daughter will live to be 100 years old. So if you're going to live overseas with your daughter, I'm not saying anything about the sons. I'm sure they're going to live a long time. That's the information I have. You're going to be there for a long time, and it's really, really going to be sort of like your task to make that environment also livable, and you're probably going to live over there. So you'll be global, and SFA, which has been a small plug for our university, is very good at offering what's called global capital. And that means that you have a different kind of environment to work in, and you're going to have a whole different kind of skill set to work with, as a matter of fact, than people have before. It's going to be very, very different. And I thought Ambassador Brasine made that point very well just by speaking in Chinese to many of you last night. And you're going to have to know more languages. I mean, that's just one part of being a global citizen now, which you will be, as a matter of fact. I heard this in Germany all the time. It was a joke. If you know 3 languages, what are you? Trilingual. If you know 2 languages, what are you? Bilingual. If you know 1 language, what are you? American. You're an American. That's exactly right. We have to get beyond that. That just has to happen. So you're going to need that. We teach Portuguese, for example, up there. And Portuguese is one of the BRIC countries. That's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Those are the ones that are really going to be ones to watch in this century for sure. So all that, and you're going to also need to travel internationally. And we have an excellent study abroad program there and international programs. And we have a representative here. If you would like to talk to her, we just had a whole group of students come back from Brazil, as a matter of fact. And I'm hoping I'll be taking a group to India in May. So if you want to enroll early, you can come along. And that would be just great. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel now, but I am going to give you a Christmas reading assignment. Wouldn't you know, and here it is. Is your Christmas reading list full or not full yet? Well, here are a couple of really interesting books. This one, pretty much everybody knows. It's by Thomas Friedman, and it's called The World is Flat. You probably know that one. Is that what Friedman is saying is that things are changing so fast, and we're becoming so multidimensional in so many different countries that it really has leveled the playing field. So you could have a business meeting, for example, and have like just screens of people like all over the world participating at the same level. So the level, it's a level playing field. Nobody has like a communications advantage. And that's the one, The World is Flat. But then there's an interesting one called, it's a rejoinder, and it's to Friedman, I think, and it's called The World is Curved by a guy named Smick. And Smick is saying, sort of the opposite things. He says that basically the world is changing so fast, the horizon is growing shorter and shorter and shorter. And we have to react very, very quickly. And sometimes we just don't have the old mechanisms to know how to react. So we've got to develop those tools. And that's going to be very, very difficult. Fortunately, we've got great help to understand that. And we have 3 sitting up here on stage to help us understand all of these challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to them first. And our first panelist, let me introduce you to Joseph Harris. Joseph is currently teaching at Boston University. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's been a recipient of Fulbright doctoral fellowship and also the Luce scholarship. His research focuses on basically the area of public health experts, AIDS activists, and the efforts to institutionalize universal health care. So, Dr. Harris, thank you so much for coming to visit with, and I'll turn it over to you for about 15 minutes. Okay.
All right, so first, I want to say thank you to Dean Brian Murphy and to Dixie Grohl for all of your extraordinary efforts in organizing this fantastic event. We were greeted with such warmth and hospitality yesterday. It was really fantastic. A wonderful dinner last night where I got to know the other participants. And what great questions. Wow. Yesterday, we were all floored by the level of discourse here, both from the panelists and also from the audience. So I look forward to continuing that today. Sort of building off the introduction of Dr. Segady, thanks for moderating, I want to say Sawadee Krap to you, which is Thai for hello and goodbye. And I also want to add one reading to his reading list. If you enjoy Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, then you might look up the work of Pankaj Ghemawat, who says the world is not flat. And it's an interesting alternative rejoinder as well, and he gives a TED Talk about this as well. So hopefully today I'll provide some food for thought that will contribute to this discussion, centering on the issues of socio-political context in Asia, looking at some of my work on global health and development and how this relates to this issue. All right, so we know it's a dynamic time in Asia right now. There's hopeful signs of growing democracy in the region. Recently, there's been a power-sharing agreement between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah in Afghanistan, ushering in the first peaceful democratic transition of power in that country. In Indonesia, there's been the popular election of Jakarta Governor Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, to power in the face of a challenge by Indonesia's powerful military establishment. In India, we have the election of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which we had a question about yesterday. And of course, there are planned elections in late 2015 in Burma. And these are just some of the major political developments. So there's also been things like popular protests in Bangladesh in 2013, aimed at putting pressure on government and corporations there to improve working conditions in garment factories. So many, many dynamic changes are happening, and these aren't all of them by any stretch. Some might even read some of these changes as something like Asia's Arab Spring, or their version of it at least. However, on the flip side, not all change has been progressive. Thailand has experienced its second military coup in 8 years earlier this year. Reports on efforts to suppress popular and academic freedom have been widespread, and the country's political future remains a serious question mark. North Korea continues to be mired in dictatorship. Citizens there suffer, and the supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, continues to cause problems for the region. And we continue to see a mixed picture in the most dynamic economy in the region, China, where the number of annual protests has grown from 10,000 in 1994 to some 87,000 in 2005, and recently culminated in popular protests in Hong Kong aimed at stopping original plans to have citizens vote for the chief executive there in 2017. In the western part of that country, China's recently made news by giving economist Ilham Tohti, who's been an outspoken critic of the government, put him in prison for life. for his criticism of the government's treatment of the Uyghur minority groups there. So taking these two pictures together, we see a real mixed picture in the region politically, with simmering tensions over long-standing issues like the South China Sea also feeding into this. All right, so what about the US? For its part, under the Obama administration, the US has tried to project a strong commitment and sense of involvement in the region. However, a number of crises around the world have proved distracting to those efforts. So there's been civil war and refugees in Syria, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the rise of ISIS, and of course, for me, a global health scholar, the largest Ebola outbreak in history, which now affects this great state. I want to stress that these are not insubstantial challenges, and they forced Washington to split time and attention between a planned strategic focus on Asia and the requirements of responding to real crises in different parts of the world. And we know what the research on multitasking tells us, that if you multitask, you end up not doing everything that you're trying to do very well. All right? But suffice to say, this is not what the administration had hoped to project about its commitment to Asia. So what is holding the region together? What are the main instruments of cooperation in the region? And ASEAN, and this is a little graphic about ASEAN's trade with different partners. We see their trade within ASEAN is quite large. It's one of the oldest regional cooperation organizations in the region. Currently has 10 members. It was founded in 1967, focuses on Southeast Asia. And among its fundamental goals are to accelerate economic growth, social progress, and cultural development in the region and promote peace and stability. But since most of you know something about Asia, you also know that the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs has been a central animating principle of the organization since its founding. And this has led to some questions about its ability to address sensitive political issues like human rights or challenging authoritarian political arrangements, and to effectively lead on issues related to political oppression. However, the organization has advanced some important and bold economic goals. So one of their economic initiatives, the ASEAN Economic Community, has set a goal of regional integration by 2015. Trade within ASEAN is already robust and accounts for 25% of total trade among members and 55% of trade within Asia. So this shows, I think, that trade is an important binding force in the region together in spite of diverse political developments that I alluded to in my opening remarks. Now, ASEAN's not the only regional cooperation organization. We also have APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which includes the US, and it's a much newer and larger political organization founded in 1989 and brings together 21 Pacific Rim countries to promote economic cooperation and free trade. I'll leave most comments on this to our panelists who will cover economic issues, but I do want to highlight it a little bit since I think it offers a nice backdrop to my own presentation. APEC's been involved in promoting free trade agreement in the Asia Pacific. And to underscore the significance of APEC nations economically, I'll just offer one statistic. Of the world's $14 trillion in trade in 2010, some $9 trillion involves APEC countries, either as an exporter, importer, or both. So while these organizations do much more than just promote trade and economic cooperation, trade initiatives and economic integration are important forces binding the region together. All right, but this is not all. So at the same time, new global developments with important power centers in Asia are shaking up established orders and challenging the authority of international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. One example is the recent announcement of the BRICS New Development Bank. And if you don't know about this, I encourage you to learn more earlier this year. And it will start with an initial capital holding of about $50 billion, and the headquarters of the New Development Bank may very well end up in China. What I want to suggest to you, as a social scientist who studies the industrializing world, is that while all these changes have received high-profile attention and are very important, there are other very powerful potential areas of cooperation that are also emerging that have received much less attention. And one particularly powerful area of opportunity that is emerging centers around technical cooperation related to healthcare. Healthcare is increasingly becoming recognized as an important obligation of governments towards their citizens and an important issue by organizations that matter in politics today. And it's not insignificant that the first BRICS health ministers meeting was held in China. So perhaps something you didn't know, and I'd be curious to get a show of hands about this, there's a growing movement towards universal health care around the world, and much of it being led by countries in the global south. Not even 2 years ago, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution in support of universal health coverage, co-sponsored by over 90 countries. Now, how many of you knew this? Did anyone? We got 1, 2, big room. All right, interesting. All right, now this came on the heels of similar resolutions at the WHO in 2011 and a Mexico City political declaration on universal coverage in 2012, which was signed by 20 countries, including the US, which does not yet have universal coverage. Now, while social scientists have for years assumed that developing nations were too poor to support expansive and expensive universal health coverage programs, by the 1990s and 2000s, a wide variety of industrializing countries had made commitments to universal health coverage, including countries like South Korea, Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, Turkey, and Vietnam. And since 2010, over 70 countries have sought WHO technical assistance to move towards universal coverage. Now, this is a membership card. This is a sample card. It's not real. For membership in the universal coverage program in Thailand. It says Bat Pragan Sukhapap Tuana, which means universal coverage card. And in Thailand in 2001, and this is the main country I study, it initiated its own universal coverage program, providing everyone who didn't have access to one of the country's existing health programs to this one. And initially, they had to pay 30 baht per visit, which was equivalent to about 75 cents. And it was waived if you were poor. And it provided everything. It started with a small benefit package, but has grown to include dialysis, cancer treatment, treatment for AIDS, heart surgery. So quite a robust program. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is not limited to Thailand, that this is a growing global movement. And we've seen particularly strong initiatives come out of Asia. So Indonesia has recently started a program, started efforts to integrate its existing programs and sets a goal for universal coverage by 2019. In 1995, the Philippine legislature passed a universal coverage law with a mandate to cover all Filipinos by 2010, called PhilHealth. While that program was not successful in meeting that goal, the government's recently redoubled its efforts and has a new goal to meet universal coverage by 2017. Vietnam has put major efforts in place to expand coverage to the poor dating back to 2005 and recently set a goal of achieving 80% population coverage by 2019. India sought efforts to improve access to health care in recent years through major initiatives at both state and federal levels. And of course, there is China, who's initiated 2 new health insurance programs, one for extending coverage to the poor and those living in rural areas in 2003, and another for urban residents in 2007. More recently, in 2009, the government announced a major investment of $126 billion in the health system with the goal of establishing universal coverage. All right, so this makes 2 things clear, I think. One is that we are seeing a shift in state obligations to healthcare around the world, particularly in Asia. And Thailand is not an isolated event. There's a major shift happening. And second, this is a big business, all right? Expansion frequently does not involve the public sector alone. There's often ample room for private sector involvement. So what has been done in this area in terms of promoting cooperation that could be meaningful for Asia as a region, particularly given all the political upheaval that's happening right now? Well, countries like Thailand have played a leading role in helping to provide technical assistance and knowledge sharing to other countries in the region and beyond who are in many ways following their lead and seeking to implement universal coverage and expand access to medicine. So the Thai experience has been shared with other countries in the region, experimenting with universal coverage, including efforts by countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Maldives to invite them to share their experiences. And here's two of the leaders in this movement. So Dr. Virot on the left is sort of an advocate who played a big role in the economic foundations of Thailand's programs. He's gone all over the world offering to share a bit about the Thai experience. And you can see from this article here, China has been an active country that has sought to learn from Thailand. Here you see Krisanna Krisintu, who has done a lot of work in trying to make medicines more affordable. And she's actually traveled to Africa to help countries in that region and others learn to produce generic medicines cheaply, effectively, and safely. But Thailand's not the only one. So Japan started its own universal health coverage program in 1961 and has played a very active role in the region promoting universal coverage. And here, the country's foreign minister speaks at a UN meeting on universal health care. And here, at a Japan World Bank conference on universal health coverage in December of last year, the World Bank's president, Jim Kim, discusses the World Bank's efforts to set targets and develop measures to chart the progress of countries towards universal coverage. Japan has been very active in funding research efforts to learn more about both the technical and political hurdles countries face in making the commitment to UC. Now, it's important to note that these high-profile state-to-state efforts have been cornerstones of cooperation, but they're not the only game in town. There's also been important efforts by universities, NGOs, and private business in the area of healthcare cooperation. What I want to suggest is that given the clear interest by different countries in the region in expanding access to healthcare and medicines and the leadership shown by some countries in the region and international organizations, the expansion of ties and cooperation in this area is something that might not only help countries solve practical problems like how to achieve good healthcare at low cost, but also something that might help bring countries in the region closer together and promote stability. And I want to suggest that that's particularly important given some of the upheaval right now, and that this kind of cooperation can have important impacts on human development. So in passing a couple times yesterday, there was comments on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is something I want to touch on briefly. While the comments I just made offer some window into how healthcare cooperation might become a greater area of emphasis around which Asian socio-political cooperation might orbit, a major question that will need to be addressed is how competing interests in the region that have social, economic, and political dimensions will resolve themselves. And I opened my presentation by touching on some of the various efforts to lower trade barriers and promote free trade in the region. One prominent effort, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, started in 2006, and it was an effort involving 12 countries, including the US, to create a free trade zone in both the eastern and western hemispheres, stretching across the Pacific. And this graphic gives some picture of the countries involved and their relative economic size. So we see countries like the US, Vietnam, Singapore, Mexico, Japan, and others there. This effort is still very much in the negotiation phases, but it represents an even stronger effort by countries in the region to promote global integration outside the region. But there have been some worries by some, including activists in the main country I study, Thailand, that provisions around intellectual property in these new free trade agreements might limit some countries' rights to make generic medicines affordable to citizens. Now, the US Trade Representative, for its part, has suggested that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would promote the availability of life-saving and life-enhancing medicines in Trans-Pacific Partnership markets. However, Doctors Without Borders, winner of a Nobel Prize, has argued that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would, quote, serve to extend monopoly protection beyond what is required by international agreements and to create new kinds of monopolies, even after patent-based monopolies have expired or where they never existed. Now, this would essentially make affordable generic medications, which these new healthcare systems depend on, harder to come by. And so here I want to suggest that while medical cooperation offers a potentially dynamic new area of cooperation that's already started but could be expanded in the region, diverse interests are at stake. And these tensions and contradictions will have to be directly confronted and managed. And here it's important to remember something. The US which I mentioned earlier, was a supporter of the global movement towards universal health care under the Obama administration, has also played a lead role in Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which some argue, at least, may threaten access to medicine. So when I suggest that medical cooperation is an interesting and potentially new area of cooperation that could help provide unity to countries in tension with one another and moving in very different directions politically, it is not one without challenges. Questions about how to expand efforts to expand trade and economic cooperation in the region have to be measured against very real potential impacts on people. But these are not challenges we should shy away from. Too much is at stake, and countries in the region have too much to gain. I'll end there, but I look very forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. And our next speaker is Ellen Boccuzzi, and she brings a very, very interesting portfolio up to us. She's the Senior Program Officer for Government and Law with the Asia Foundation. Prior to that, she was a Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. She's worked as a consultant for a wide range of organizations, and she has taught at University of California, Berkeley, and also at a university in Thailand. And Ellen, tell me how you... Thammasat University. No, I'm bilingual. Yes, and she is an author of a book which is called Bangkok Bound, and it focuses on the rural to urban migration patterns, and it's based on first-hand accounts of immigrants, which we'll be using in our globalization class, actually, this time around. So, thank you. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yes, okay, great. Thank you for coming today. My name is Ellen Boccuzzi, and as you mentioned, I work with the Asia Foundation. And today I'm going to speak on governance programming in rapidly urbanizing areas of Asia, which is a new program area for us. In talking about this topic, I'm hoping to address question 4 under governance, regional cooperation, and demographics, as was posed to us by the conference organizers. And the question was, what are some possible solutions for stabilizing the region politically? How should the US engage Asia in a constructive manner? So I'd like to begin with the context. Rapid urbanization in Asia is something we're seeing across the region. Currently, nearly half of the population of the Asia-Pacific region lives in cities. More than half of the world's megacities are now found in Asia. A megacity is a city with at least 10 million people. By 2025, we expect about half of the projected megacities to be in Asia, and this is important for a number of reasons, one of which is that megacities are important drivers of the regional economy as well as the global economy. Internal migration, particularly people moving from rural areas to cities, is currently the largest contributor of population growth across Asian cities. And economic growth, as I mentioned, is led by cities in Asia. So currently, about 45% of the population of Asia is urban, but those urban residents account for 80% of the GDP in the region. So urbanization brings a number of opportunities as well as challenges. The opportunities include economic growth, as I mentioned, also potentially more efficient use of resources due to greater density of people living in cities. But there are challenges as well. And to get these opportunities, we really need to manage the growth well. Challenges include the number of slum dwellers. About 30% of Asia's urban residents currently live in slums. So slums are places where people don't have necessarily access to water, to sanitation, durable housing, or sufficient living space. And there's substantial inequality in Asia's cities, and poverty is now growing faster in urban areas than in rural areas in Asia. So those are some of the challenges we're up against. There's a number of governance challenges in rapidly urbanizing areas as well. Service delivery, given strained or inadequate urban infrastructure. There's unequal access to public services among urban residents, and this is particularly true in informally settled areas, so in slum and squatter settlements or informal settlements. This is a particular challenge, getting services such as healthcare to residents. Registration regimes and access to rights among the unregistered. So in areas where settlements are informal or where citizens are not registered, for instance, areas populated by rural urban migrants where migrants might not be allowed to have urban registration, or where they may prefer to keep registration in the rural sending area. For instance, in Thailand, we've just heard quite a bit about Thailand, often migrants prefer to keep their registration in their home sending area because then they have inheritance rights to their household, to their house. So there are reasons such as that registration may not be in the urban area. So when that happens, migrants may have, or residents in the urban area may have difficulty accessing both services and their rights. They could lack political representation, access to justice, and the ability to participate meaningfully in their own governance. Other issues and challenges in terms of governance in rapidly urbanizing areas include housing and land rights and employment. In cities, vulnerability is compounded by inadequate access to land and employment. People live in areas they can afford or areas that are available, and these are often the most precarious and exposed areas. So those urban dwellers may be prone to, or may be vulnerable to eviction, for instance, or they may live in areas that are particularly prone to climate change disasters, to flooding, things like that. With regard to employment, there is a huge informal sector in urban Asia. The WTO estimates that informal workers make up 78.2% of total employment in Asia, so that's huge. As a result, much of the Asian workforce remains excluded from union participation and vulnerable to exploitative working conditions, among other things. So these are some of the reasons that urban dwellers may have difficulty with access to justice and citizen participation. Corruption is also a huge issue across Asia, and it compounds many of these other challenges. Transparency International, in their latest ranking, ranked 62% or 64% of the countries in the Asia Pacific as corrupt at some level. So urban issues, as you can see, are quite complex, and they have multiple root causes. Addressing these issues requires a multi-pronged approach that takes into consideration the legal framework, the governing structure, the resources, and the environment of the city in which the city is located. So in recognition of these dramatic changes and the challenges, the Asia Foundation has recently instituted a new programming area to focus on governance challenges in urban areas of Asia. So the approach we use to address these challenges includes working with urban governance to strengthen their capacity and effectiveness, facilitating increased cooperation and exchange of information between local government and citizens, and that's urban government as well, strengthening the capacity of citizens' organizations to advocate for more effective urban governance, strengthening relationships between the private sector and municipal government, and supporting national and local counter-corruption efforts. We take a collaborative approach to promoting greater citizen participation and more accountable and responsive governance by helping citizens to engage governments to create workable policies and plans, and then helping them to monitor the implementation of those plans. On the citizen side, we support citizens, groups, and citizens to voice their needs and interests, while working with the municipal governments to develop the capacity to address these needs, and also to develop an understanding of why an inclusive process is important. We also support activities to expand the technical and managerial expertise required to manage urban growth, including mechanisms and processes that will improve planning and facilitate integration between government departments in service delivery. So for example, in Indonesia, we're currently working on pro-poor and gender-responsive budgeting efforts at the local level. So on the citizen side, we work with civil society organizations and citizens groups to help them learn how to read budgets and analyze budgets, and then to advocate for budgeting policies that support women's needs, that support poor needs, and other marginalized groups' needs. So we're working both on the capacity building side so they can actually analyze the budgets, but also on the advocacy side so that they can voice their concerns. On the government side, we work to help them better understand the need for an inclusive process. So it's important that the process be inclusive and take into account the citizens' needs so that, one, the money can be spent effectively to actually address the problems that are there, and two, to help build trust and confidence between the government and citizens. So for instance, citizens would be happier to pay taxes, we could say, if they think their money is not just going to a corrupt government, but is actually going to their needs. I don't know if happy to pay taxes is the right way to put it, but multi-stakeholder collaboration is another thing we do. We put together forums that bring citizens, government, and private sector together to basically work on these budgets. So I'm going to talk about a case study in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, and to look at sort of more specifically what we're doing in urban service delivery specifically. So we work with municipal governments in a number of Asian cities, currently in Ulaanbaatar, in Phnom Penh, in Kathmandu, and in Delhi, to reform and modernize their delivery systems through a collaborative approach. So as I've mentioned, we support citizens to articulate their needs, including through crowdsourcing and mapping of data about their communities. So we're using a lot of ICT for development right now. We help citizens and municipal governments analyze this data and learn how to analyze this data and develop technical solutions to meet the needs expressed by citizens. And we work with citizens and government to implement and monitor the response to the implementation. So this is a photograph of the Ger, one of the Ger districts in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. And you can see the sort of round building in the front. That's called a ger, and it's the traditional house of a nomadic family in Mongolia. But what you have now is over 50% of about 50% of the population of Mongolia is actually living in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city. And more than 60% of the people living in the city are living in these unplanned districts. So you actually have people building their traditional nomadic homes right in the heart of the city. And these areas are similar to informal settlements in other parts of Asia, but people actually have land tenure. So you have these huge unplanned settlements that are at different districts within the center of the city and then ringing around the city. And you can see in this picture that there are some fences. And that's because, unlike many of the cities of Asia, in Mongolia, people actually have the right to a small amount of land in these informal settlements. So they're allowed 0.7 hectares of land. So what you have is, people staking out a little part of the city and building a traditional ger or a very simple house and then having kind of a fence around it. Now, until recently, the government did not recognize these as official districts at all, and they were unplanned and they were without services. And there's quite a few challenges to delivering services. As packed-in as they look, they're low density in that people are individually in households. There's a lack of infrastructure, including roads, water, and sewerage systems. There's inadequate waste collection, and there's a dearth of educational facilities for children living in those areas. The income levels are from low income to middle income in these areas, and a significant proportion of the Ger residents work in the informal sector. So that's a little bit about the Gers in Ulaanbaatar. Now we're working in Ulaanbaatar with both the municipal government and with the national government. We're also working with the community. And we're doing a number of different programs, but one that I would like to talk about is a community mapping project that we did over the course of about 2 months, where in close collaboration with the municipal government, we worked with community to have them map what their needs were. So they basically mapped the availability and accessibility of services in 6 different sectors: in water, health, education, public transport, solid waste management, and safety. So these maps that the community themselves created basically provided accurate data and increased knowledge of public services that were available in these areas. And they're now being used to engage citizens in discussions about what public services are needed and what their priorities are for their communities. And they're being used by the municipal government as a planning tool to analyze what the needs are in these areas that have only now been recognized, and to prioritize resources and make recommendations for city investment in the Ger areas. So the outcomes are more informed investment requests from citizens, district and horo governments to the city. Horo is just the Mongolian word for subdistrict. Enhanced capacity of city staff to use GIS tools and perform analysis. So this is sort of a secondary outcome in training people to do this community mapping. They actually have had to build their technical capacity on GIS. We've created a baseline for setting of service standards and tracking progress. So now both the community and the municipal government know what the baseline is, where the service delivery stands now. And so as we move forward, we can see, are they really making progress? Are they providing better services or not? And perhaps most importantly, the community maps were used for the FY14 budget discussions and included in capital planning procedures for 2014. So previously, where these districts weren't even recognized by the government, they were sort of just denied as informal settlements that don't get services. Now they've actually been folded into the master plan for planning. So I'll stop here. I just want to come back to the original question. How can we engage Asia constructively and help stabilize it politically? And I would say that the Asia Foundation is working on the ground to do this by strengthening local systems. So we stand sort of behind, but we work to strengthen local systems and strengthening democratic processes in Asia by supporting citizen engagement as well as government responsiveness. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And our third and final speaker for this panel is Dlynn Armstrong-Williams. And Dlynn is currently the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And her teaching areas are Asian politics, comparative foreign policy, and international relations theory. So she definitely has a strong background in just exactly the questions that we want to address. And her research focuses on South Korea, and its status is now a middle power country and certainly rising. So Dlynn, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for that introduction. My presentation will be a little bit different than the earlier presenters. And it's really because we were really educated about two thematic ideas so far, right? So a thematic idea about healthcare, a thematic idea about urbanization. But my presentation is going to focus a little bit more because I'm actually from the University of North Georgia, and we're a senior military college. So because we're a senior military college, we have the opportunity to see things in a way that tend to be a little bit more traditional. And so I'm going to bring that perspective along with some of the things that I was able to garner in a recent conference I was able to go to between the Republic of Korea and essentially the U.S. Army. Really sponsors this to keep the relationship up between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. So really, I think what we've learned from yesterday and today was the importance of what was referred to as narratives, okay? Narratives are a concept or an idea about how you see the world. And yesterday we were introduced to really a narrative about perhaps how the West could be seen as highly colonial or exploitative of Asia, and how those narratives then affect present-day interaction. But I think that the important part of this is that all of these countries, and as they interact, they have these constructed narratives of past experience and history and culture. And as they look through these lenses, this becomes one of the greatest difficulties in looking at Asia. If the one thing we've learned in the past 2 days is that Asia is a huge and complex place, right? And there's so many different peoples, religions, viewpoints across that region that in some ways it becomes very difficult to see this big overarching entity. So my presentation today is going to take just a little sliver of that entity. And I'm going to look a little bit about the Korean relationship with the United States, how it evolves, and in some ways the American preoccupation with North Korea, right? We, just on the news this morning, I don't know if you guys watched the news this morning, but the news this morning, shots were fired across the border because some activists in South Korea released balloons, hoping for messages of democratization. The North Korean troops shot the balloons down, and some of that artillery fire crossed the border, and that makes national news in the United States, right? You'll see all of these huge things that the two other presenters talked about, and you're like, did you ever hear about that? No, not really. But you heard that we shot down some protester balloons, right, across the DMZ. So there is a kind of preoccupation in some ways in the relationship about the DMZ. one of the things that I think we have to understand when we look at the U.S.'s relationship in Korea in particular is that it is dynamic and it is changing. And the relationship, particularly with South Korea and the United States, is a very fluid one. One, however, that the United States seems to kind of be time-bound at times in our narrative, meaning we look back at the Korean War and the armistice and we said, we got this, right? Well, the South Korean viewpoint's a little bit different, and a little bit different about the concepts of security. So what I wanted to discuss first was how U.S. foreign policy can enact this very delicate balancing act in trying to be a strong player in the region, and for South Korea in particular, because they are so perfectly geographically located, how they can also play a very important role in Northeast Asia in particular. One of the issues becomes that there's tremendous pressure on the South Korean government to find a peaceful way out of the conflict with North Korea. And the present president, Park Geun-hye, she really is focused on something called Trust-Politik, trying to develop trust with North Korea, trying to develop bridges. And like many of these initiatives that you'll learn about in Asia, APEC, a variety of Asian initiatives for trade, these start and they start and they start and they start. And patience and timing is incredibly important in Asian culture. And so Trust-Politik follows on the heels of the Sunshine Policy that went before it. It follows on a variety of other initiatives of South Korea reaching out. But where the United States has found their biggest areas of kind of tension is when the South Koreans are reaching out towards the North Koreans, and the United States, however, doesn't want to reach. The United States develops a more hardline stance. One of the most difficult times was whenever our president labeled North Korea as part of the axis of evil, at the same time when South Korea was very much actively trying to reach out to the North. So sometimes this discontinuation, this kind of disconnection between the United States and our partner, Korea, causes tension in the region and causes the relationship to not progress forward, perhaps, as we would like. So one of the things is that South Koreans are really supportive of U.S. troops. They want U.S. troops in the region. In recent analysis, the South Korean and opinion polls were very, very interested in keeping U.S. troops in Korea, and I'll bring you some statistics in a few moments about that. However, they're concerned because when the United States built really the alliance with South Korea, it was really a three-pronged alliance. It was between South Korea, the United States, and Japan. South Korea has a traditional relationship with Japan that at times was not very positive, right? As you know. And so as the United States continues to kind of try to push those two countries together, there's some natural historical background that kind of pushes those countries back apart. And so South Korea has been increasing their trade significantly with China. And they started really as Deng Xiaoping opened up trade from China. And as South Korea did that, they found a wonderful market. South Korea had mid-level technology that the Chinese could capitalize on. They were not competitors, and trade skyrocketed between South Korea and China, partially under No Tae-woo's policy of Nordpolitik, reaching out to the north. And they thought that they could essentially triangulate back onto North Korea and become best friends with China, and then that would then pressure North Korea to a certain extent. And so as they did that, the trade increased dramatically between these countries. And because of that, their trade interest between those countries is now very, very close. What's interesting in the relationship, however, is China has advanced a lot in technology and their development of products. So now the technology that the Koreans had that was superior to early Chinese technology is now competitive against Chinese technology. And so because of that, there are some tensions in the relationship that are emerging due to that. Remember we were talking about narratives and history. Well, the Chosun dynasty in Korea was very close to the Chinese. There's a traditional link really between the Koreans and the Chinese that is much more positive than their link with the Japanese. And so because of that, one of the U.S. concerns is that the Koreans might have a proclivity to turn towards China. And China is very concerned about the United States using the Korean alliance along with the alliance with Japan to hem them in, to keep them sort of under control, to keep them sort of pushed up into North Asia. So because of that, there's this balancing act that every good middle power gets involved in, where they're trying to make sure they can balance against the U.S. viewpoint as well as the Chinese viewpoint, as well as other viewpoints throughout the region. But one of the things that I think we have to understand is that the Koreans in general in South Korea do not want to antagonize China at all, and they also understand how much they rely on the United States for their security. Academics are discussing a little bit about a movement kind of towards China and away from the United States. However, presently 93% of South Koreans believe it's necessary to maintain the U.S. alliance. They're very strongly dedicated. And it's really substantially out of fear of North Korea, right? So after unification, they have asked the question, once the peninsula unifies, do you still want U.S. troops? Well, that drops down to 66% of the population wants U.S. troops then. So it's very much based on the threat from the north. In that same survey, however, South Koreans were asked if South Korea should increase security cooperation with China when the U.S. and Japan increase their cooperation together. 79% of Koreans said yes. So there's a balance in this triangular relationship where if the United States moves closer to Japan, the Koreans feel the opening to move a little closer to China. So the role of the U.S. is a very positive one. It brings about, one of the kind of military scholars said, listen, Northeast Asia is wonderful because it's so understood that there is stability in the instability. We know that North Korea is going to be a problem. We know, okay? And we've known that for a very long time. So it's not stable, but it's not stable in a way that is somewhat predictable. And so because of that, it allows U.S. foreign policy to hopefully have some time to catch up and react. One of the things that you're learning in the past 2 days is that it's very difficult because the time that you have to change foreign policy and react to globalization pressures and things that happen all over the world is shortening and shortening and shortening. And this becomes very difficult then for states to react in a very quick way. So one of the second questions that we were asked to discuss was kind of what should be the United States play any role in the movements supporting democracy? So this was one of the other questions we were supposed to touch on today. And as you guys have been watching TV and you've been paying attention to the news, you've seen a bunch about the Umbrella Revolution, right? And so you've seen a bunch of stuff going on about the Umbrella Revolution, and the question is, what should the United States do? One thing we should perhaps do is watch. I think that the reality is that as we engage, then there are other issues, because if you remember yesterday's comments, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine and the U.S. sphere of influence, and then the question is, what's the United States' role there in that sphere of influence? And we're still trying to feel that through, and so because of that, these democracy movements are wonderful things, but in many ways the United States might adopt a more Asian outlook and watch to see how these might develop. The other question that we were supposed to look at is kind of talking about if Asia's moving more towards regional cooperation and regional blocs, or are they moving away from that? You've seen all kinds of evidence. We've talked about APEC. We've talked about other economic partnerships. There are all kinds of movements towards Asia for this greater regionalism. But I remember a long time ago when I wanted to pick a dissertation topic in the 1990s, there were still then movements towards this greater regionalization. And the question becomes, how are the Asian countries doing this? And I think one of the things that's actually happening is under the umbrella of the WTO, increasingly Asian countries are involved in bilateral free trade agreements.
And so when you look at the data, you'll know that by the middle of 2013, there were 75 free trade agreements signed in Asia, but only 4 of them were regional. So there's a huge growth in bilateral free trade agreements in Asia. And this is because there's flexibility under the WTO to do this. And one of the ones I have to mention, of course, because I'm talking about Korea, is the Korean-American, Korean-US free trade agreement, right? That's been very, very important for the relationship. I think it's important for the relationship partially because it changes the U.S. narrative away from simple military power when it looks at Korea. Other things are also being discussed. And so the idea, and several authors that write on free trade agreements about Asia are talking about perhaps the next area of cooperation will be resource-driven free trade agreements. These very narrow free trade agreements for Asian economies that are desperately in need of particular resources to assist their industrialization. So the final question was what are solutions for stabilizing the region politically, and how should the U.S. continue to engage in a constructive manner in Asia? I think that one of the struggles the United States has is that we rely too quickly on hard power. One of the things that you'll hear about more and more probably in this conversation is the fact that the United States' reach of soft power or attractive power, wanting countries to be like the United States, adopt our values, our belief system, things like that. We're sort of losing out in the game. And one of the concerns for many people who look at policy, and if you're a more conspiracy kind of theorist who think about the United States competing against China, China has adopted something called Confucian Institutes, right, throughout the United States, throughout the world, to try to spread a viewpoint of the world that tends to be more Chinese-based and focused. And the question is what has the United States done in response? Well, we've done certain things. We have campaigns that we have to send more Americans to China, right? More students to study abroad in China to try to build the relationship between those countries. We've also started another initiative, 100,000 strong, to try to send more students to Latin America to try to build those relationships. But a huge initiative like that is actually, in the Korean examples, being sponsored by the Korean government itself. So it's very interesting. But Lee Myung-bak, who was the previous president of South Korea, adopted a program to try to encourage Americans, predominantly Korean Americans, to come to Korea to teach English. Well, what a wonderful vehicle if the United States would have promoted that, to promote U.S. viewpoints in the Korean Peninsula through a program that way. So I think the United States has a lot of opportunity to expand their soft power, but I think that one of the struggles we have had in Asia is we've focused very much on hard power and military activities as opposed to soft power ones. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope you'll have great questions for us. So thank you so very much.
I think you'll agree that we had 3 excellent presentations this morning, and we'll open it up for your questions in just a few minutes. We don't have much time, but we'll open it up. You could really see some of the themes from today's talk sort of intertwined, interwoven with some of the things that we heard yesterday. There's an interesting concept developed by a thinker named Rollo May, and he says, we're trying to transition from a position of power over to power with, which is, I think, a more practical kind of employment of our power, but it also seems to sort of confuse the message, because the message is going horizontally now in different kinds of ways where it didn't have to go that way. It was just vertical. So I think you're seeing some of the problems, but also some of the potentials here, I do believe, as really you're seeing some interesting developments along those lines. So with that, I think I'll open it up for your comments. Let me move the microphone in the middle.
Good. If you want to ask a question, please come up to the microphone and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, I'm Jasmine McClam from Clements High School, and I have a question for you, Mr. Harris. Will internal tension in the United States over healthcare stop us from participating globally in the new medical cooperation you mentioned in your presentation? Thank you.
That's my question too.
It's a great question, and I think one worth thinking about for a very long time. I mean, so far the record is that it hasn't, right? That the Obama administration has been supportive of these efforts in spite of internal divisions over healthcare. I think that there are still opportunities, but we have elections coming, you know, and so the sort of field may change and the calculations may change as a result, but I expect under this administration there will still be some involvement, but I think that, again, there are conflicting aims, right? We have a desire to promote free trade, and in that respect, that carries with it some economic interests, and those sometimes can run into pressures against the aims of promoting universal coverage. So those things have to be addressed.
Could I ask a follow-on question to that? I'm curious about the role of sort of the Gates Foundation and other large non-state actors in the U.S. that promote public health. I mean, does that sort of change the game to have all this money coming from not the U.S. government, but from private foundations into public health, into these efforts?
Mm-hmm. So, and to understand the question, how that money has affected this movement towards universal coverage. So I think that one of the most supportive organizations of this movement towards universal coverage has been the Rockefeller Foundation. They've had a program called Health System Strengthening that started in 2008, and they've funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into promoting universal coverage, knowledge sharing, a global south-to-south network of knowledge sharing between different nations like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others, and have been active in supporting efforts at the international level as well. So they've been a very big player. Obviously, Gates has been important in helping to address, I think, practically issues related to malaria, TB, and AIDS. But in terms of access to generics, I think some of the most important work has been done by some countries in the region that have played a leading role in that area, learning more about their rights under the WTO with respect to issues like compulsory licensing, parallel importation of generic medications, what rights they have under free trade. One of the things that is kind of departing from this point that I wanted to also get across that may not have in my presentation is that this area of cooperation has as much potential as we want to make it. So when I also study South Africa and efforts to institutionalize national health insurance there, which have failed for a couple of decades, and there's a lot of complex reasons for that. But there has been discussions about the creation of a health passport in Southern Africa, so that countries could actually, citizens in countries, in one country could go to another, show their health passport, enter medical facilities, and get care. And you can imagine this being a great help to people who travel internationally. However, the issue is this. There are countries at very uneven levels of development with very uneven levels of health infrastructure and resources, which makes those kinds of practical linkages and cooperation difficult. And so these ideas are out there, and that idea represents some of the deepest level of cooperation that could happen. But I think even these knowledge-sharing kinds of avenues are really important.
Good morning. I'm a student at Clements High School. My name's Arslan Absal, and I go to the Global Studies Academy. And I had a question on basically education and its involvement for like regional politics. So do you feel like with the rather lack of education for rural citizens in Southeast Asia, for example, do you feel like it's led to a monopoly for like rich urban migrants into the government and say like a lobbying sense in that we have present here in America? And do you feel like education itself would help progress rural citizens to be more participating into the national governments of these nations?
I can take that on Thailand. I'd be interested to answer that question. There's a lot of answers to that question. I was about to say one thing, but no, I'm thinking again. Yes, there is a lot of power held traditionally in the urban realms in all the countries in the region, and it is easier to funnel into the political power if you start out from a wealthier urban family. That's true. However, looking at the Thailand case right now, the education system is relatively good throughout the country, and people, the public schools are better than the private schools in Thailand. So you take a test to get into the public universities. If you do well on the test, then you go to the best university. Their version of Harvard is a public university. If you don't do well on the test, then your parents pay, and you go to a private university, which is less prestigious. Looking at now what's going on in terms of political power, as the growing educated middle class is developing, we see sort of political conflict in the country, because the northeastern part of the country has traditionally been poor and agricultural, but as those individuals who actually have a huge voting bloc, because it's the most populous part of the country, as they become more educated and more aware of their rights, they're really contesting the power in the center, and it's led to political stalemate in Thailand and a number of coups. So I think, change is happening in Asia in a number of countries, and I'll let some of my co-panelists speak further.
Sure, yeah, I would agree that educational policies are incredibly important in these countries, as well as just to call your attention to the fact that education is one of the awesome things that really drives student mobility. And as students have the opportunity to leave one country and go to another country for educational opportunities, they become major assets for the country that they choose to study in. So those countries that have been very successful at attracting international students who do not have opportunities because of the strong testing structures in countries such as Thailand and others, if they have a functional immigration policy, that also helps them draw that talent. And so there's many countries in the world that are not displeased at the structure of that, because they can draw some of the best talent in the world.
My name is Breeze Garcia, and I also go to Clements High School. So granted, there are a lot of unstable and impoverished Asian countries, and a lot of the times foreign countries and NGOs have to actually go in or send people into the countries to actually help the government out. So my question is, what happens when you offer aid to a famished nation, but they decline because they don't like the idea of foreigners actually interfering and going into the countries? What steps do you take, and how can foreign countries and NGOs help these countries of concern?
Who would like to take that?
I can start. The short answer is, if those countries don't want your help, you don't give it. They have national sovereignty. I guess the longer answer is, when it's in our strategic interest to give help, you try to persuade. And the first example that comes to my mind, and particularly in humanitarian crises, for instance, so the first example that comes to my mind is Cyclone Nargis, which happened a few years ago in Myanmar, where that was before Myanmar had opened up to the extent that it has recently. And everybody knew that there were tens of thousands of people killed, but there was no information coming out of Myanmar at that time. And the country said, no, we have it covered, we don't need your help. And so it took a lot of negotiation bilaterally and through the UN to be able to even get into the country and begin to give people the assistance that they really needed. And then that turned into a huge humanitarian assistance effort that lasted for a couple of years. But it took at least a week before anybody could get into the country.
And I would just add to that, I teach a course on state building and failure in developing countries, and I would just stress that aid is not the magic bullet. That even once countries greet aid with open arms, it can create its own problems, and this history is well documented. And another book that I would put on your Christmas reading list would be one that was co-authored by the new head of state of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, and that book is called Fixing Failed States. And he picks up this very issue in great detail in that book, and it's a quite accessible read.
Hi, I'm Ryan Kelly. I'm also a student at Clements High School. And Ms. Williams, you mentioned the U.S. reliance on hard power in relations with Asia and the need to expand soft power, which I thought was a very good point. So I was wondering, how specifically could the U.S. expand their soft power relations with Asia?
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent question. And I believe that one of the struggles that we have is that the hard power is an immediate need. Right? It's easier to convince funding for hard power than soft power, right? What has happened is there are many foundations, such as the ASA Foundation, others, who have stepped in to try to provide these avenues for soft power relationships between the United States and Asia. The struggle with that, however, is the government doesn't control it, right? So when we look at the public diplomacy budget of the U.S. Department of State, it was cut tremendously. In the wake of 9/11, it increased substantially, but only to Iraq and Afghanistan. So in reality, the funding hasn't been provided for those initiatives, and there's been hope that universities and others would then step in and fill the gap. And so some of my research is looking at that and to look to see if universities are successful in trying to fill that gap, or if university students are the best prepared to articulate U.S. foreign policy. That's one of the struggles for the university. Thank you.
We have time for just these last two questions.
My name is Taylor Aguilar. I'm a student in SFA, political science major, concentrating on international relations. I'm a senior, and I guess my question for you, Professor Williams, is that what would you say the nature of North Korea-Sino bilateral relations is, and given China's current ascent and North Korea's continued defiance as a rogue state, what is the future of this relationship?
Wow, that's a great, big, awesome question. So the question is the future, really, of the relationship between North Korea and China. And so you guys were probably paying attention to the news, right? And you saw the assassination of Kim Jong-un's uncle. Do you remember seeing that? Okay, that was a signal for Beijing. And he really was the conduit that Beijing felt they could utilize to influence Kim Jong-un. When he was assassinated, that was a signal that they did not want that kind of connectivity between Beijing and North Korea. He also, of course, had some issues of corruption, but many officials in North Korea have such issues. So the Chinese were very concerned by that. And in some of their discussions kind of in the region, they were concerned about that. It's interesting. The reality is that North Korea, one of the really interesting things I've read lately talks about how North Korea is used as a proxy by China because previous to that, Pakistan essentially had all of the nuclear weapons and was spreading nuclear technology across the world and things like that. That then stopped, and so now North Korea is doing it. And so China can't essentially share nuclear information with Iran because of their relationship with the United States, but North Korea can. So one of the arguments is the Chinese tolerate the North Koreans because they feel that they can actually be vehicles of Chinese foreign policy. So that's a very short answer to a very complicated question.
Once again, thank you for those great questions. And we also want to thank our excellent panelists. And I will take a short break here, and I believe they'll be available if you have other questions to ask them. So thank you.